Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Curious Mind podcast. Today, I would like to talk about a topic that is important for psychology, for psychotherapy, and for the zeitgeist as it is today, which is to set boundaries. So, I would like to reflect with you on how to set boundaries and the advantages and disadvantages of doing so. Generally speaking, there are boundaries that I set for myself and those that I communicate to others. These are the two kinds of boundaries. The goal of boundaries is to create clarity for myself and for others. But boundaries and clarity are not necessarily part of normal life. In life, everything is interconnected. Every situation requires a new commitment, a new weighing up, and a new evaluation. So setting boundaries is an artificial act in a way, a limitation that does not remain on its own, but has to be maintained with effort, continuous effort. Let me first describe boundaries for myself and how to do it best. When I set up a boundary for myself, I should ensure, precisely because it takes effort to maintain a boundary, that my unconscious supports me. It's important to ensure that my unconscious is supporting me. And to do this, I have to be clear to myself how the boundary helps me and how it fits into my system of needs and values. So I have to become conscious of that, to lay down the arguments. And with this clarification, with this constant conscious evaluation, I ensure the support of my unconscious. If my unconscious does not automatically support this boundary, I need to learn to recognize my external and internal triggers, to avoid those and to move away from them. Okay, so that was a little bit abstract. Let's take the example of a drinking problem. So, for the sake of the example, I imagine that I have a drinking problem and want to keep control of it. In order to set a boundary for myself and not make a serious mistake with a slip up, I need to clarify where exactly this boundary lies and why it is important to me. For example, I can decide that I will no longer drink alcohol when I go out with friends. But how far does this boundary extend? It is, in its essence, quite vague. Can I have a glass of wine at home with my girlfriend to relax? Can I drink alcohol on special occasions? Or is it okay to have only one beer in company as long as I keep it to one? So I have to figure out those precise cases so that I don't struggle in the event, so that I know exactly what is okay for me and what not. And when I do clarify these questions with myself, I should be completely honest in considering those different case scenarios and their consequences by weighing up the pros and cons and understanding how they affect my health and my relationships and my general well-being. Only then do I decide on a rule for my drinking. The honesty is the base of this, is the foundation, because based on this evaluation, based on the honesty, I'm creating the consequences for my behavior. And only if I start with a foundation of really sober honesty, I can develop cases that make sense to me. So I cannot get lost in idealistic beliefs about what I'm capable of, what I'm enduring, what cases I could tolerate without any problem. I cannot get lost in the fantasies of a well-adjusted being in this. I have to be really honest and sober in my assessment. In this way, I ensure that my unconscious is in harmony with that limit that I have set, the boundary that I have set. However, if my inner parts are unbalanced and different needs or feelings could lead me to drinking uncontrollably, I must be careful not to set up a rule that weakens me because of my conflicting intentions. For example, if drinking is my only context where I could meet my friends, then I'm obviously in a dilemma here because I want to meet my friends, At the same time, they are drinking and inviting me to drink. So I'm conflicted. And when I'm conflicted with needs that are similarly important to me, which have a high priority, I make it difficult for my unconscious to support me because it is torn. And so I have to rather artificially, without the full support of my unconscious, set up limitations, set up boundaries, know my triggers so that even without the full support of my unconscious, I can maintain those boundaries because otherwise I would have to face grave consequences. So in this example, keeping up the abstention would really challenge my willpower. So again, I have to learn about the specific triggers that could tempt me to disregard the boundary I've set for myself. And I have to understand, when do these triggers appear, for example, in the company of certain friends or even one of those friends. In which places, it could be that at certain places my willpower is weakened. For example, if I'm in a cafe, because usually after a cafe, we would go to a bar. At what times, for example, in the evening, it might be weaker than during the daytime. And in the presence of which groups of people, what kind of company. For example, if I'm in a company of strangers, I might be more insecure. I might feel socially awkward, and then I might be more tempted to drink because usually I would think that I'm more funny, witty, and sociable when I do drink. So I have to be careful and I have to be mindful of those triggering circumstances. And when I'm aware of those triggers, I understand what the first signs of the loss of control are that I already know. And as a consequence, I remove myself from those situations. Okay, so this is the analysis that I do. And from this analysis, I can learn which situations I should avoid or in which situations I need to take regular breaks to collect myself. So let's say I do want to continue to go to cafes with friends, even though it lowers my inhibition to afterwards join them to go to a bar or to a club where I would drink. So even already in the cafe, I go out to have a smoke, to have a short walk around the block, or go to the bathroom. And so I withdraw from those slippery slope triggers. And when I withdraw, when I'm in the bathroom, I recollect myself. I remind myself why it is important for me to keep away from the alcohol. I remind myself that going into a bar with them, even when I tell them that I don't want to drink, and even if they do support me, that the probability that I will get weak becomes very high. So I collect myself, I ensure at least some support from my unconscious. Then I go out again to the group of friends and I execute the plan that is best for me. Now, this was the boundary towards myself. If I set up a rule, if I have goals towards myself, and it's about me maintaining those boundaries, me applying those limitations. It is completely different when it comes to establishing boundaries to other people. First of all, I should have no illusions about how willing others are to accept my boundaries. It may be that my boundaries are not a problem for them. And if I'm not interfering with their needs when I express my boundary, if I ask them to do something or I ask them to not do something, if it doesn't interfere with their needs, then they might be quite willing actually to support me. But if my boundary means a restriction for their needs, then I can only hope that their respect and their affection and their love, if it exists, will help them to acknowledge my boundaries. If there is no such thing, if I'm asking someone to respect my boundary who doesn't have a particular respect for me, not a particular affection or love, why should they do it? I think today we live in a time when people think and assume that just because I've told someone that something is important for me and that they should respect this boundary, that they will or should accept this. Why is that the case? Why would that be the case? Everything we know about psychology is when I start to interfere with the need of another, with a belief, with a conviction of another, that they will not be interested to support my cause. People have a tendency in many circumstances to be selfish, so they will look after their satisfaction of needs, not mine. So, a crucial factor in the success of boundary setting is open communication. It can be helpful to clarify in discussions how much my boundary represents a restriction for others, for example, my girlfriend, and in return to offer to respond to her needs so that she does not feel that I'm only making demands without taking her needs into account. So if I ask her to, in certain situations, treat me in a certain way when we're in public, when the supermarket, making groceries, and so on, and she has established a habit that somehow annoys me or where I feel disrespected, then I'm asking her, I'm setting a boundary, I'm asking her for support to respect a certain boundary. But I understand that for her to change her habit, particularly when she doesn't see anything wrong with it, and where I admit, look, this is me, I'm sensitive about this, I understand that for you, it's not a big deal. For me, it is. I'm asking for your support, which is a very kind boundary setting. But I understand for her, it's a limitation. And so I both appreciate that she's doing it for me, and I'm offering my support when it comes to her needs so that she understands that I'm grateful and I'm not just making demands, and it's not a power play. Once I clarified this, it is important to regularly check how things are going. So I'm asking her for a certain behavior in public, going back to that example. She says, okay. And I regularly check how it's going. And I let her know after a few weeks, after a month, if this is to my satisfaction, if I'm asking her for further support, I'm letting her know if she's too much has slipped up in her behavior. I have to assume, again, because it is about another person and their priority is not to satisfy my needs. I have to assume that they will forget. I have to assume that I have to set up this boundary repeatedly, and that with time, with compassion, with open, honest, benevolent communication, step by step, this boundary, this limitation will be respected. There will be inevitable small violations of the rule. How can it not be? And I have to decide if I can tolerate them. And if it is, then I don't have to communicate again. I don't have to bring it up. If I don't tolerate them, I have to look for another conversation. And then should we just adjust the agreements that we have to make them fairer, maybe? Maybe she feels that I'm exaggerating, or is it okay as it is? So these were a few examples around boundary setting for myself and for the other. When considering whether and how boundaries should be set, you must consider the basic advantages and disadvantages. And there are not only advantages to boundary setting. The big advantage of a boundary is the clarity it can create, both the clarity that I can communicate. For example, I don't drink alcohol when I go out. This is the clarity to others and the clarity for myself, namely the clarity of the principles that I adhere to. This gives me a clarity, a guideline for my life with boundaries, rules, limitations. Yes, they are restricting my behavior, sometimes my thoughts, sometimes my feelings, but they also let me know who I am. This is good for me, and sometimes it is useful also to be able to communicate this to others. It creates a certain rigidity and a certain stability. The disadvantage of boundaries is that they are artificial to a certain extent and always have to be maintained with a certain amount of effort. I have to remind myself, I have to check myself, I have to understand how I want to behave in situations that are not clearly delineated, that are more vague, that I've not defined for myself. And I have to maintain this boundary, to maintain this limit when it comes to the application by other people. In the example with my girlfriend, I have to remind her. She might not have understood what it's about the first time, the second time, the third time. So I have to renew this understanding and so on. This is one disadvantage. Now, if my boundaries are too unrealistic, this can lead to frustration, either because I cannot maintain my own boundaries and violate suppressed needs, or because others constantly disregard them. And here I've undervalued how unrealistic this boundary setting it is for them. So if it is unrealistic for them to apply my boundaries, they will constantly disregard them. And the possible price for that is frustration, feelings of powerlessness, or if I internalize the criticism, self-depreciation, and possibly even aggression towards others. Helplessness and aggression are often connected. Now, what is the alternative to rigid boundaries? If I do without fixed boundaries, the advantage is that I can react more flexibly to different situations. Then I am more open to life and I can feel myself and others more intensely. Keep in mind, boundaries create limitations, can create rigidity, can create a lack of vitality. And if I have loose boundaries, it can allow me to stay in the moment, to experience the moment and people in a fresh way, and so to create feelings that are more direct and more intense. The disadvantage of few or no boundaries is that I can get lost in the stream of constantly changing circumstances because I don't actively respond to them with limitations. And so, as a consequence, to possibly endure too much harmful behavior from others and to notice it only too late. So, for example, I am with people who have the habit to take too much space in a conversation. I don't have any boundaries. I tell myself that I go with the flow. I react to people as they are. They take much more space than I do habitually. I spend with them some time, maybe a weekend on vacation. Maybe those are friends. So over the weeks and months, we spend much time. And only later do I realize that I feel a hesitation to meet them again. Somehow I feel some animosity, I feel an aggression. I start to have thoughts that I don't like them very much. And this would be due to me not having set up boundaries. Boundary in this case would be to interrupt them in conversations or in confidential conversations to let them know how I feel, that I need a little bit more space, that it would be kind of them to ask me every now and then and not just to take the space and to assume that I'm fine with it. And by not having done that, I would have created a violation of my needs to be acknowledged, my need to be heard, and so on. And then, too late, I would notice that I feel this negativity, this hesitation, this resentment towards those people. So, this is a danger. And without firm boundaries, I may not develop, as I mentioned before, the ability to manage, control, and direct my life in the direction that suits my needs. Because when I do formulate for myself boundaries, it gives me a better understanding of who I am, especially if those boundaries are set up in conjunction with the understanding of my unconscious, with my needs. And then I know who I am, I know who I want to be, and I know in which situations I want to get. Right? So one danger of not having set up those conscious boundaries might be that I get lost in external circumstances and uh, I'm drifting along into a life that I have not chosen. Okay. Now, overall, just to summarize, setting boundaries is a useful tool, but it's also a concept that does not necessarily reflect the normal, the natural state of the mind. And so when you set boundaries, you have to carefully consider and adapt them over time. It's not healthy psychologically to set up a boundary and to assume that it will hold its value over extended period of time, over months and years. We have to update them just as much as we have to understand, we have to update our own understanding of ourselves or to update relationships. And it is important to find a balance that takes into account both our own needs and the needs of others when we set boundaries. Like I said, also in the example with my girlfriend, I have to understand that a boundary from my side might be perceived as a limitation on her side, and I have to counterbalance that. And I have to remain flexible in order to respond to life's challenges without sucking the joy out of life with too rigid rules. If I'm surrounding myself with boundaries, with limitations, if I'm walking around constantly in my mind or in communication, telling people how to treat me, what to do in my company, and so on, then so much energy goes into maintaining those boundaries, or in my mind, complaining that people don't keep those boundaries, that indeed it has the potential to suck the joy out, to suck the vitality out of life. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a basic component of psychology, and it can be a basic component of therapy, which brings me to the point to kind of advertise therapy to you. Statistically, it is known that people with sometimes quite grave mental issues keep them for many years without doing anything. Maybe they think they will go away by themselves. Maybe they have experienced some improvement and then are happy with the plateau and would think that they're resilient enough and so on. The fact of the matter is that mental illness is taking a lot of energy from us, and it's difficult to revert that. The longer we accept a mental illness in our mind, the more it becomes habitual, and the more a difficulty has become habitual, and this can be also in relationships either. So it can be either within myself or in a relationship. Then it becomes more difficult to repair it, to fix it, to turn it around. Why? Because something that is habitual becomes almost invisible. And the whole, not the whole, but a good part of the therapeutic process is to understand what is going on. But if it has become virtually invisible because of long habit, it removes the possibility to see what is going on. And then kind of the detective work to put the puzzle pieces together becomes more and more difficult and just takes more time, which can cause, again, frustration. It can cost time, it can cost resources, and so on. So, this is why it's good to consider when you see that in over time the problems you are facing are not going away by themselves, as they sometimes can, or they're not going away by talking about them with trusted friends, with your partner, and so on, then I think it will be wise to consider therapy. Choose a trusted therapist. This can be either by recommendation or by finding them online, for example. And here, online therapy just gives you much more flexibility. Now, I understand, of course, that many people prefer a therapy with an in-person therapist, but it just limits you to the regional possibilities around you. And experience shows that many of those are fully occupied and just don't have a spot left. So online therapy is a possibility to be more flexible and to find someone to your liking. I am an online therapist myself. In the description, you will find a link to a getting to know each other session that is for free. And I'm happy to support people with those videos, with those podcasts. You also get an impression of how I think, how I tend to perceive the mind, how I support people. And if you're interested in this approach, then I'm happy if you contact me, and I would be happy to support you. Okay. Like the content, subscribe if you are interested in other similar content in the future, and I would be happy to see you soon. Goodbye.